Stop. Don't rush to turn the page because now we are about to tear the masks off those you were taught to worship as the secret icons of classic Hollywood. Welcome to a world where silk gowns and expensive perfume concealed something feral. You thought the golden age was all elegance and good manners. Think again. We are stepping into a zone of absolute darkness, where queens of the screen became executioners. These women didn't just play drama, they lived in a state of permanent war with reality, with their colleagues, and with their own sanity. While the world admired their beauty, even the bravest men trembled on film sets. We will open the archives on tyrants in skirts, whose cruelty was refined and whose hunger for power knew no limits. Prepare to see the true face of Hollywood, where tenderness was nothing more than a mask for madness, and every smile could be a signal for destruction. But before we begin with the first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write a comment. Enjoy the show.
Joan Crawford didn't merely live through Hollywood's golden age. She was its most disciplined, efficient, and lethal mechanism. Her rise from a waitress and dancer in cheap clubs to the blinding queen of MGM was paved not only with talent, but with the figurative corpses of those who dared stand in her way. Crawford was a woman corporation. Emotion was weakness. Control was the only acceptable form of existence. Behind the flawless cheekbones and wide, luminous eyes hid a personality whose cruelty was so methodical and calculated that it transformed reality itself into a sterile hell, where the smallest mistake was punished by psychological or physical annihilation. While the world saw her as the ultimate symbol of discipline and hard work, those behind the closed doors of her mansion knew the truth. Joan Crawford had lost her humanity and replaced it with the iron will of a tyrant. The most terrifying manifestation of her madness was her obsession with cleanliness and order, which evolved into a pathological regime of domestic terror. For Joan, her home was not a place of rest, but a stage set that had to be perfect 24 hours a day. Her cruelty toward her adopted children, Christina and Christopher, became legendary, forever etched into history under the title Mommy Dearest. Crawford used the children as living accessories to sustain the image of the perfect mother, but once the camera flashes faded, the nightmare began. She could drag them out of bed in the middle of the night and force them to scrub the floors with toothbrushes if she thought a single mark remained on the parquet. The infamous incident with the wire hangers, when Joan flew into a rage after finding a cheap hanger in her daughter's closet instead of a velvet one, was only the tip of the iceberg. She didn't simply scream, she systematically erased the children's sense of self, withholding food, locking them in dark closets, and forcing them to watch as she burned their favorite toys in the fireplace for the smallest offense. On set, Crawford behaved like a top-tier predator, showing no mercy to rivals. She was convinced that there was room under the sun for only one star, herself, and she was willing to commit any act of sabotage to wipe a competitor out. Her long, venomous feud with Bette Davis was not a clash of diva egos, but a true war of attrition, with Crawford playing the role of a master strategist of pain. During the filming of the cult thriller Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, her cruelty reached its peak. Knowing that Davis suffered from serious back problems, Crawford deliberately stuffed her pockets with heavy stones and lead weights in scenes where Bette had to drag her across the floor. She took pleasure in her colleagues' physical suffering, all while maintaining an icy composure in front of the camera. She set traps, bribed staff to spy on her rivals, and used her immense influence with studio executives to crush the careers of young, promising actresses before they could fully rise. Crawford's cruelty was unchecked because she truly believed she was right. In her mind, the world was a battlefield, and anyone who refused to submit to her rules deserved destruction. Her pathological narcissism demanded absolute devotion. The moment she sensed independence in someone, she switched to total suppression. She could persecute a person for years over a single careless remark, using her connections in the press to turn their life into ruins. Crawford was a master manipulator, often playing the victim in order to strike with even greater force. By the end of her life, her obsession with control had turned into mania. She disinfected everything she touched and demanded the same from the few people still allowed near her. Joan Crawford died alone, surrounded only by the ghosts of her former greatness and the hatred of those she once called family. Hollywood remembers her as a great actress, but one whose soul was scorched by an insatiable thirst for power, a woman transformed into a beautiful, soulless idol, demanding bloody sacrifices at her altar.
Bette Davis. Bette Davis was a woman who didn't simply enter Hollywood history. She smashed through it in a fury. If Joan Crawford was a cold strategist, Davis was a natural disaster, an uncontrollable fire that scorched everything in its path. Her cruelty knew no limits because she believed her rage was a form of honesty. Warner Bros. Spent decades trying to rein in this volcano, but Bette proved stronger than any system. She was called a sacred monster, and the title was earned. She possessed a rare talent for turning other people's lives into an emotional hell, wielding her intellect like a scalpel and her voice like a whip. Davis lost control of her aggression early on, and by the height of her fame, her temperament had become so toxic that a single appearance on set was enough to freeze an entire crew in terror. Bette Davis's cruelty was intellectual and theatrical. She took pleasure in her ability to humiliate people in public. On set, she was an absolute dictator. If a director lacked a titan's will, Davis crushed him and seized control of the process herself. She could stop a take and in front of the entire crew mock a young actor's inexperience until he was reduced to tears and professional paralysis. Her venom was especially lethal toward those she considered pretty nothings. Bette despised actresses whose success rested on beauty, and she used every second on screen to dominate them physically and psychologically. She would deliberately step on a co-star's hem, accidentally strike her during a fight scene, or block her light, turning the rival's work into nothing. Her cruelty was a form of self-affirmation. Davis believed her talent granted her the right to any violence inflicted on those around her. The legendary war with Joan Crawford for Bette was not mere professional rivalry, but a personal mission of annihilation. Davis made no effort to hide her hatred. She reveled in it. During the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, when she had the chance to strike Crawford on the head in one scene, she did it with such force that Joan required stitches. Afterwards, Bette proudly declared, "I should have done that 20 years ago." Her cruelty thrived in details that drove Joan to the brink. Davis installed a Coca-Cola vending machine on set. Crawford was the widow of Pepsi's owner and a member of the company's board, a constant reminder of her enemy's defeat. She showed no mercy even to the dead. When Joan Crawford passed away, Davis delivered her infamous epitaph, "You should only say good things about the dead. Joan Crawford is dead. Good." But the darkest side of her cruelty emerged in her relationships with those closest to her. Her daughter, B.D. Hyman, later described her mother as an emotional vampire who demanded absolute devotion and destroyed any attempt at independence. Davis used love as an instrument of torture. She staged monumental scandals, faked heart attacks, and threatened suicide to keep her loved ones trapped within her control. She was relentless in her need to dominate other people's lives. When her daughter dared to write memoirs about her mother's tyranny, Davis did not simply disown her, she erased her from existence with a fury as if B.D. had never lived at all. She remained faithful to her anger until the end, choosing solitude and hatred over forgiveness. Bette Davis died without ever laying down her weapons, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and towering performances, each one shadowed by the real pain of those who dared to love this woman catastrophe. Hedy Lamarr was called the most beautiful face in the history of cinema, yet behind that divine symmetry hid a mind as cold as a scalpel and a soul consumed by paranoid fire. Hedy was not merely an actress, she was a brilliant inventor whose ideas laid the foundation for technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. But it was precisely this super intellect, combined with Hollywood's isolating glamour, that gave birth to a monster. Her cruelty was unlike the explosive rage of Davis or the iron discipline of Crawford. It was the cruelty of glacial detachment and absolute contempt for the human ants surrounding her. Lamarr gradually lost her grip on reality, transforming into an arrogant diva who saw everyone she met as either an enemy or a tool designed to satisfy her needs. On set, Hedy Lamarr's cruelty was quiet and suffocating. She possessed a rare talent, the ability to make people feel worthless with a single glance from her perfect eyes. Her paranoia dictated the rules of her world. She believed everyone was trying to steal her beauty, her ideas, or her time. Her arrogance was uncontrollable. She could ostentatiously read a book on higher mathematics while a director tried to explain a scene, making it clear that his opinion meant nothing to her. She drove makeup artists and costume designers to nervous breakdowns, demanding impossible perfection and accusing them of deliberate sabotage if a shadow fell on her face in a way she disliked. Her cruelty manifested itself in a complete absence of empathy. Colleagues were merely extras in the epic film of her life, and she demanded their dismissal without hesitation for the smallest, often imaginary offense. As the years passed, her loss of control over her own psyche escalated into open warfare against the world. Lamarr developed pathological suspicion. Her cruelty toward household staff became legendary in Hollywood. She searched maids' personal belongings, accused them of stealing diamonds she herself had hidden, and sued loyal employees who had worked for her for decades. She took pleasure in legal persecution, seeing it as a way to assert her superiority. Her personal life became a graveyard of 6 marriages, each ending in scandal and mutual accusations. Hedy's cruelty toward her children stemmed from her inability to love anything but her own reflection and her technical blueprints. She was a cold, distant mother who saw children as an inconvenient obstacle to her freedom. It is known that she did not speak to her adopted son for years, erasing him from her life with the same ease she erased failed takes from a film reel. The tragedy of Hedy Lamarr lay in the fact that her cruelty ultimately turned against herself. In her attempts to preserve her fading beauty, she became a victim of botched cosmetic surgeries, which only intensified her hatred of the world. She locked herself inside her home, turning it into a fortress, and communicated with the outside world solely by telephone, often spending hours exhausting casual acquaintances or lawyers with endless grievances. Her paranoia grew so extreme that she began committing petty theft in stores, not out of necessity, but for the thrill and the sense of power over a system she believed had betrayed her. Lamarr died in complete solitude, leaving behind a world that uses her technologies but never truly knew the woman hidden behind the mask of the beautiful monster. She was an ice goddess who burned every bridge leading to human warmth, choosing instead the eternal cold of her own paranoia.
Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was a woman who didn't merely ignore rules, she devoured them. In the sterile, carefully calibrated world of the Golden Age, where a star's image was manufactured by armies of publicists, Tallulah was an anomaly, a force of nature Hollywood never managed to tame. Her cruelty was not cold like Lamarr's, nor methodical like Crawford's. It was the cruelty of chaos, drunken excess, and an almost mad contempt for human dignity. Bankhead was the Black Widow of high society, a woman whose low, smoke-scarred voice could seduce or destroy a career with a single acidic remark. She had lost control of her vices so long ago that by the time she reached her peak, she no longer knew where her true self ended and the demonic performance began, a spectacle that ruined the lives of everyone caught within its blast radius. Working with Tallulah Bankhead on set felt like walking through a minefield in the middle of a storm. Her cruelty was impulsive and unpredictable. She delighted in shocking people, reading their embarrassment and pain as proof of her power. Tallulah might arrive at rehearsal completely naked just to watch young actors blush, or suddenly unleash the filthiest insults at the lighting crew, driving them to the edge of collapse. Alfred Hitchcock, who directed her in Lifeboat, admitted that she was the only creature he could not control. Bankhead exhausted film crews with endless demands, drunken tantrums, and a habit of turning the workday into an orgy of her own ego. Her cruelty lay in stripping people of peace. Around her, no one ever felt safe, because her venom could spray in any direction without warning or reason. Off-screen, her cruelty took the form of refined psychological sadism. Tallulah was a master of intrigue and social cannibalism. She possessed an almost supernatural instinct for other people's secrets and weaknesses and used them without the slightest hesitation. Moments of kindness were mistaken for mercy, but they were always followed by a strike. She might invite a friend to a party solely to expose the details of her secret affair in front of everyone, or to mock her financial ruin with theatrical relish. Bankhead was relentless in her urge to destroy marriages and alliances. She treated it as sport. There were cases when she deliberately seduced her colleagues' husbands, only to discard them publicly, savoring the double humiliation of her victims. Her home was a place where reputations and sanity were lost, where guests were dragged into an endless marathon of her vices and corrosive wit. The darkest side of her nature revealed itself in how she treated those who depended on her. Assistants and secretaries rotated through her life like a kaleidoscope, unable to endure the constant abuse and impossible demands. Tallulah could force someone to work for 40 hours without sleep, then fire them for looking insufficiently lively. She was a tyrant who demanded not loyalty, but total dissolution into her shadow. As the years passed, her loss of control over alcohol and drugs turned her life into a continuous nightmare. She might call a colleague at 3 in the morning and pour out hours of hatred and complaints, never allowing a single word in return. Tallulah Bankhead died as she lived, in a haze of cigarette smoke and furious denial of reality. She remained in history as a woman who turned her life into a grand scandal, proving that chaos can be just as cruel and devastating a weapon as the sharpest blade.
Miriam Hopkins was a woman whose cruelty was described by her contemporaries as the most refined sadism in the history of cinema. While other actresses tore everything apart in fits of rage, Hopkins worked like a skilled poisoner, administering her venom drop by drop until her victim was completely paralyzed. With the appearance of a classic Southern belle, angelic curls and a soft drawl, Miriam concealed a calculating glacial intellect that recognized no right to exist but her own. Her cruelty was disguised as professional perfectionism, but in truth it was a pathological hunger for power. Hopkins had lost control of her envy so long ago that by the height of her fame, she had become the Black Widow of film sets, whose arrival on a project meant the inevitable death of someone's career or peace of mind. On set, Miriam Hopkins' cruelty took the form of exquisite sabotage that drove her co-stars to the brink. She was a recognized master of scene stealing, a collection of dirty acting tricks designed to pull the audience's attention away from her partner. Hopkins might suddenly begin adjusting her hair, coughing loudly, or rustling her dress at the exact moment another actor delivered a crucial monologue. When asked to stop, she would put on a mask of wounded innocence. "Oh my, was I distracting you? I was only trying to make the scene feel more alive." She was relentless in her determination to psychologically destroy her rivals. Her war with Bette Davis entered Hollywood legend as a clash of two monsters, but where Bette screamed and hurled objects, Hopkins whispered venomous remarks just before the call of action, forcing her opponent into the frame with hands trembling in rage. A special form of cruelty emerged in Miriam's treatment of directors and technical crews. She saw them not as collaborators, but as servants obliged to fulfill every whim. There was a notorious incident in which she forced an entire crew to wait 8 hours while she searched for the right mood in her dressing room, sipping champagne and listening to music. Hopkins reveled in her ability to halt a multi-million-dollar production simply by refusing to step in front of the camera. If she sensed that a director was paying more attention to another actress, Miriam would begin systematically destroying his reputation, complaining to producers about his incompetence or insinuating sexual misconduct, accusations that, in that era, amounted to a career death sentence. She was a predator who didn't merely consume her prey, but toyed with it, savoring the slow agony of someone else's collapsing dignity. Miriam's personal life was no less of a battlefield. Her cruelty toward men was legendary. She chose partners she could manipulate, then methodically dismantled their self-esteem, reducing them to pale shadows of themselves. Her need to dominate was uncontrollable. Even in later years, when her fame began to fade, Hopkins did not soften. She surrounded herself with young actors, promising protection and advancement, but in reality using them as unpaid servants and targets for her corrosive humor. She could publicly mock a physical flaw in someone she had called her protégé just the day before. Miriam Hopkins died, leaving behind a reputation as a woman hated by nearly everyone she worked with. She was a poisonous orchid that bloomed only when everything living around her began to wither from her endless intrigues and her cold, calculating madness.
Constance Bennett. If there was ever a person in Hollywood who truly believed in a divine right to trample human dignity, it was Constance Bennett. She was the highest-paid actress of the early 1930s and the most hated woman in the industry. Her cruelty was not born of childhood trauma or alcoholic delirium. It was deliberate, lucid, aristocratic cruelty, the kind practiced by someone who saw other people as mere biological scenery for her triumph. Constance possessed the beauty of a delicate porcelain figurine, but inside her beat the heart of a serial killer of reputations. She had lost control of her arrogance so long ago that by the height of her fame she had become an icy dictator, convinced that politeness was a sign of vulgarity and compassion a flaw in one's upbringing. On set, Constance Bennett's cruelty took the form of absolute despotism. She was one of the first stars to dictate demands to studios that bordered on madness, insisting that shooting schedules bend to her tennis games or fittings with Parisian couturiers. Her treatment of technical crews became legendary. Constance could fire a lighting technician in the middle of the day simply because the sound of his footsteps irritated her ears. She never addressed stagehands by name, referring to them as those people or hey you, and could force a makeup artist to redo her work for hours, driving the woman into hysteria before delivering the verdict, "Now you look just as bad as your work." She was relentless in her need to humiliate those who could not fight back, seeing their submission as the only proof of her superiority. Young actresses inspired a special kind of hatred in Constance. She regarded them as filthy upstarts. Her cruelty toward them was refined and surgical. She might demand that a script be rewritten so that a rival was left without a single meaningful scene, or publicly mock a girl's manners, dismissing her as a kitchen maid draped in pearls. Bennett was a master of psychological isolation. She created a vacuum around herself in which anyone who failed to show proper deference was instantly cast out. Producers feared her like fire because Constance knew the price of her name and mercilessly blackmailed studios with threats to halt production if her whims were not satisfied immediately. She was a predator wrapped in silk, one who did not merely demand luxury, but demanded that it be torn from the hands of others. Off-screen, her cruelty was no less boundless. She changed husbands and titles, at one point becoming a marquessess, yet in every marriage remained an ice-cold tyrant. Her cruelty toward men lay in emotional annihilation. She demanded absolute worship while offering nothing in return but contempt. Constance was uncontrollable in her egocentrism. She could forget her own children for months if she was absorbed in European high society. When her career began to fade, her cruelty hardened into corrosive sarcasm, which she poured over anyone who dared show her sympathy. Until her final breath, she maintained the mask of frozen perfection, never realizing that beneath her pride there was nothing left but emptiness. Constance Bennett left this world with a reputation as a woman too beautiful to possess a soul and too arrogant to be human.
Frances Farmer. The story of Frances Farmer is a chronicle of how dazzling beauty and formidable intellect can fuse into a combustible force that detonates everything around it. While other actresses used cruelty as a tool to gain power, for Frances, cruelty was a mode of existence, the only language she had to communicate with a world she despised with all her heart. She was Paramount's golden girl, the new Greta Garbo, yet beneath that flawless surface pulsed an uncontrollable rage. Frances lost control of her hatred for Hollywood's Vanity Fair so quickly that the industry never managed to tame her, it only managed to break her. Her cruelty was elemental, explosive, and utterly without restraint. It was the cruelty of someone who deliberately charges headfirst into collision, indifferent to who might be destroyed along with her. On set, Frances Farmer was a living nightmare whose fury spared no one, from powerful producers to ordinary hairdressers. Her cruelty took the form of open defiance and physical aggression. She could torment directors for hours with arguments about the falseness of a script, and when words ran out, insults and violence followed. There is a well-known incident in which Frances flew into a rage over a hairstyle and struck an elderly hairdresser so violently that the woman had to be hospitalized. Her outbursts were uncontrollable. She spat in assistants' faces, smashed sets, and openly called studio executives pimps in expensive suits. Authority meant nothing to her, and she reveled in the chaos and fear she spread around her. She didn't merely sabotage productions, she turned them into gladiatorial arenas where the only victor was her rage. Off-screen, her life became an endless chain of scandals and violent episodes that shocked even a hardened Hollywood. Frances's cruelty toward her own mother, Lillian, was extreme. She saw her as the primary enemy, the woman who had sold her into Hollywood slavery, and their encounters almost always ended in physical fights and mutual curses. Farmer was a master of public humiliation. She could stage a drunken rampage in an upscale restaurant, hurling dishes at patrons, or brawl with police officers who tried to restrain her. Her cruelty was aimed at destroying all bonds. She pushed friends away, betrayed lovers, and methodically dismantled her own reputation, seeing this self-destruction as the purest form of freedom. She lost her grip on reality, and her anger became her sole guide. The tragedy of Frances Farmer was that her cruelty toward the world ultimately granted the world moral permission to respond with cruelty of its own. Her arrests, forced commitments to psychiatric hospitals, and the rumors surrounding a possible lobotomy became the final movement of her struggle. She was a predator who, in her fury, cornered herself. Frances's cruelty was the scream of a soul that found no other way to assert its existence except through pain and destruction. She remains in history as a symbol of a lost generation of stars, a woman whose intelligence became her curse and whose rage became her only legacy. Frances Farmer burned in the fire of her own madness, proving that when cruelty becomes the meaning of life, it inevitably devours its creator, leaving behind only ashes where beauty once lived, and the bitter memory of a rebellion that brought happiness to no one.
Loretta Young was the embodiment of purity, piety, and Hollywood grace. She was called the Steel Butterfly, a nickname that perfectly captured a woman whose wings were sharpened to a razor's edge. Loretta's cruelty was the most dangerous kind of violence in Hollywood, cruelty disguised as righteousness. Unlike Frances Farmer, who screamed her defiance to the world, Young worked in a soft, insinuating voice, destroying people's will through guilt and moral superiority. She turned her Catholic faith into an instrument of punishment, ruling her empire with it. Loretta lost control of her Pharisaism, becoming a woman who could bless someone with one hand while using the other to close the doors of the industry forever over the slightest failure to meet her personal standards of holiness. On set, Loretta Young's cruelty took the form of petty yet total surveillance. She was obsessed with controlling other people's morality. Her famous swear jar was not an act of charity, but a tool of psychological domination. Grown men, hardened veterans of film production, were forced to pay a fine for every curse word, reduced to humiliated schoolboys in the presence of Saint Loretta. She was relentless in her need to dictate the rules. If she disliked the behavior of a supporting actor or an assistant, she never confronted them directly. She simply went to the producers and declared that the presence of this sinner offended her sensibilities. That alone was enough to leave a person jobless and penniless. Her cruelty lay in creating an atmosphere of suffocating sanctimony, where any natural human impulse was treated as a crime against Her Majesty. The most terrifying and cynical expression of her cruelty was the story of her own daughter, Judith. After becoming pregnant by the married Clark Gable during the filming of The Call of the Wild, Young chose not to tell the truth, but to stage a monstrous performance that lasted a lifetime. To preserve her image as a pure maiden, she fled to Europe, secretly gave birth, placed the child in an orphanage, and a year later officially adopted her own daughter. This cruelty was aimed at the closest soul of all. Judith grew up in a house where her mother made her feel like an object of charity, hiding the truth about both her father and her mother. As the girl grew older and began asking questions about her Gable-like ears, which Loretta forced her to hide under bonnets and even had surgically altered, Young continued to lie, protecting her precious image. She was uncontrollable in her deceit, choosing to damage a child's psyche rather than allow the world to see a crack in her flawless facade. Off-screen, Loretta Young was a cold manipulator who used religion as a shield against any criticism. Her cruelty toward husbands and lovers lay in the constant sense of inadequacy she cultivated in them. She demanded a holiness from her partners that she herself did not possess, and discarded them mercilessly when they failed to live up to her fantasies.
By the end of her life, her sanctimony had become almost grotesque. She could speak for hours about mercy while refusing help to ruined relatives, claiming that their suffering was God's will for their sins. Loretta Young remained in history as a great actress whose life was a triumph of hypocrisy. She proved that the most terrifying cruelty is the kind delivered with a gentle smile and a prayer on the lips, turning the lives of those around her into a purgatory with no escape as long as Saint Young still lived.
Linda Darnell was one of those women whose beauty seemed too perfect to be real, yet whose soul was burned to the ground by Hollywood while she was still a teenager. Where Loretta Young used morality as a shield, Linda Darnell used her own downfall as a battering ram, smashing the lives of anyone who dared come too close. Her cruelty was born of profound despair, amplified by chronic alcoholism and a pathological hatred for the industry that had turned her into a sexual object at the age of 15. Linda lost control of her life so early that the only way she could assert her existence became violent outbursts and shocking acts of self-destruction, dragging colleagues, husbands, and random witnesses into the wreckage of her collapse. On set, Linda Darnell's cruelty took the form of unpredictable psychological torment. While she was sober, the world saw a disciplined professional, but once the first glass of gin entered her bloodstream, the beauty vanished and a monster took her place. Her cruelty was aimed at sabotaging the work itself, a form of revenge against 20th Century Fox, which had exploited her body for years. Linda was uncontrollable in her drunken episodes. In the middle of a take, she might unleash the foulest insults at the director, hurl props at cameramen, or simply walk off the set, leaving hundreds of people frozen in uncertainty. She reveled in the chaos she created, reading the panic of producers as proof that she still held power over them. Her cruelty lay in her complete indifference to the labor of others. She turned the filming of classics like A Letter to Three Wives into an endurance trial for the entire crew, pushing everyone to emotional exhaustion with her whims and aggression. A more primal, almost feral cruelty emerged in Linda's relationships with men. She was a master of emotional terror. Darnell chose strong, successful partners only to methodically dismantle their reputations and their sanity. Her cruelty thrived on public humiliation. She could stage explosive scenes of jealousy at elite social gatherings, escalating into physical violence, scratching faces, biting, and dousing her partners with wine under the flash of cameras. She was relentless in her need to inflict the same pain she herself carried. Her husbands lived in a state of constant dread, awaiting the next breakdown, slowly transforming from confident industry figures into exhausted caretakers for a woman who despised them for their weakness. Linda used sex and her beauty as bait, luring her victims into the trap of endless scandals and court battles. The tragedy of Linda Darnell was that her cruelty was a form of slow self-destruction, one that consumed everyone close to her. She was uncontrollable in her drunken madness, committing acts she could not even remember the next morning. Her family life was reduced to ashes. She accused her mother of having sold her body to Hollywood, and their meetings inevitably ended in mutual insults and smashed dishes. Linda was a predator who devoured herself first, then everyone around her. Her death in a house fire in 1965 was a darkly symbolic end to a life that had itself been an unending blaze of rage. She remains in history as an angel with the face of a sinner, whose uncontrollable cruelty was a scream for help that the world chose to drown out with clinking glasses and the blinding flashes of paparazzi cameras. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was not merely an actress, she was Hollywood's main attraction, the famous sweater girl whose sexuality earned MGM millions. But behind the blinding platinum blonde and porcelain skin hid a nature whose cruelty was passive, egocentric, and lethally dangerous to anyone drawn into her gravitational field. If Bette Davis struck with words, Lana Turner destroyed through the sheer mechanics of her life. She was the real-world embodiment of the Black Widow, a woman who changed husbands like gloves and attracted violence as if by magnetism. Lana lost control of her passions and ambitions so completely that her life became an endless noir, where others paid for her whims in blood, and her own daughter became the ultimate victim of maternal egoism, a chain of events that led to the most notorious killing in the history of the Dream Factory. On set, Lana Turner's cruelty was that of an absolute prima donna. She possessed a pathological need to be the center of the universe. Her cruelty lay in her total disregard for the existence of others. She could force a film crew of 300 people to wait 5 hours for her entrance because she felt her makeup did not glow enough. Lana was uncontrollable in her demands for luxury, compelling studios to cover her extravagant wardrobe and hotel bills while threatening to shut down production at any moment. To her, people were merely tools. Cinematographers existed to illuminate her beauty, directors to worship her talent, and co-stars to serve as scenery for her triumph. She could destroy the career of anyone who dared correct her, using her influence with Hollywood's highest powers. Her soft cruelty lay in an icy indifference to other people's labor and time, driving colleagues into rage and depression. Yet, Lana Turner's true feral cruelty emerged in her private life, which became the epicenter of a blood-soaked tragedy. She was reckless and uncontrollable in her choice of men, drawn to shady figures and dangerous adventurers. The pinnacle of this madness was her affair with Johnny Stompanato, a gangster and bodyguard to Mickey Cohen. Lana knew of his sadistic tendencies, but her ego craved danger and violent intensity. Her cruelty lay in allowing this monster into the life of her 13-year-old daughter, Cheryl. While Stompanato beat Lana and threatened to slash her face with a razor, Turner continued her game of fatal love, turning her child's existence into a chronicle of terror. The climax came one night in 1958, when Cheryl, defending her mother from another explosion of the gangster's rage, stabbed him with a kitchen knife. Here, Lana's cruelty reached its peak. She effectively used her daughter as a shield for her own mistakes, then transformed the trial into her greatest acting performance, weeping before the jury and salvaging her reputation at the cost of her child's permanently shattered psyche. Off-screen, Lana Turner remained a cold, calculating manipulator. Her 8 marriages were a cycle of emotional abuse. She demanded complete financial and emotional surrender from her husbands, discarding them the moment a more advantageous match appeared. Her cruelty toward men lay in their total ruin and moral exhaustion. Even in old age, she did not lose her venom, continuing to compete with her own daughter and envy her youth. Lana Turner died leaving behind a world that remembered her not for her roles, but for the bloody trail that followed her silken trains. She was a femme fatale not only on screen, but in reality, a predator whose cruelty was masked by the scent of expensive perfume, and whose loss of control over her own self turned her biography into a cemetery of broken hopes and indelible bloodstains.
We conclude our journey through the dark back alleys of the psyche of 10 queens of the Golden Age, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives, ruined careers, and spilled blood that was never washed from Hollywood's glamorous stages.
These stories are not merely biographies, they are an anatomy of how unlimited power and worship turn the human soul into a scorched desert where cruelty becomes the only law. We have seen that behind every perfect frame, every seductive smile and fatal glance, there lurked titanic rage and a pathological hunger for control, growing into true madness. Crawford, Davis, Lamarr, Bankhead, Hopkins, Bennett, Farmer, Young, Darnell, and Turner, each of them was beautiful in her own way, and each was monstrous in her own way, proving that the light of the spotlight blinds not only the audience, but the stars themselves, stripping them of the ability to distinguish reality from performance, mercy from weakness. This cycle has laid bare a terrifying truth. The Golden Age stood on the steel spines of tyrants, women who were ready to sacrifice their children, their husbands, and their colleagues so that their names would never fade. Cruelty was their currency, their armor, and their only way to survive in a system that was itself built on blood and exploitation. We have seen many faces of evil, from cold, methodical tyranny to drunken, unpredictable chaos, from aristocratic contempt to the poisonous sanctimony of the self-righteous. These women lost control of themselves, becoming prisoners of their own dark impulses, and in that loss they acquired a fearful, destructive power. Now, with the masks torn away, we understand that true Hollywood is not a film with a happy ending, but a dark abyss where the brightest stars prove to be the most merciless monsters. Let these 10 chapters stand as a reminder that the price of eternal fame is often paid with humanity itself, and that in the shadows of the Golden Age, the echoes of the madness we have just dissected can still be heard. This is the end of a story about cruelty, but only the beginning of our descent into the true, unfiltered chronicle of the most dangerous place on earth.